welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by the author of a book that I sort of read at record speed. It was absolutely propulsive. I could not put it down, and I am so excited to talk about it today. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
My name is Madeline Ashby, and I am the author of, among others, Glass Houses, which is a novel about a startup that is recently acquired and takes a celebratory trip. Their plane is forced to make an emergency landing on a remote island populated entirely by one building, which is a large black glass cube. And at first it is very hard to get in, and then it is much harder to get out.
That's a great pitch. It is such a fascinating setup, and it really is like for every mystery that, sort of gets solved, it introduces five more, and it is so addictive for that reason. And before we get into the book itself too much, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your career and your journey to the book. You've studied a whole bunch of interesting things like cyborg theory and strategic insight, foresight and innovation. I read, like, you have a lot of interesting background. How has that all shaped your writing and this book?
So I work primarily as a consulting futurist, which means that I sort of help people have conversations about the futures of their organizations or their agency or their department or their company or things like that. It's not one-to-one individual stuff necessarily, but it is about helping people entertain deeply grounded visions, multiple possible future visions, or of many possible futures, rather, that are grounded in research and grounded in trends and grounded in what we know to be true about new scientific development and new technological development and so on. So it involves like keeping abreast of a lot of different trends all at once, sort of keeping your ears to the ground all the time, and thinking about those things as ingredients in the larger, stew that is constantly being stirred of time. And so often in that work, I am asked to write short stories or to help the client in other ways envision what many possible futures will look like on the ground, what their experience of them will be, what the customer's experience of them will be, and so on. And so I've gotten quite used to writing very short stories that are very evocative of a specific future on a short timeline. So that trains you to do a few things very quickly that when they are deployed across a broader scale, like that of a novel, can be very helpful. And so it's sort of like learning all the different skills of a triathlon or something like that in separately, and then you put them all together. And so that's sort of what I do. And I'd been a writer before. I've been a writer basically my entire life. Even when I was a little kid, I would like sort of recite stories aloud to myself before I could write and before I could type. I would do all the funny voices myself, and I would rehearse and rehearse and rehearse and rehearse because I was very lonely, like only child. And, thank God my parents didn't have money because they probably otherwise would have, tried to cure me of that or something. But they had no money, so there were no doctors. Or there were doctors, but they were all for my ears and other things. And so I got into that, and then I wrote my first book when I was about 14 years old on the challenge from a grade 9 social studies teacher he was a Fulbright scholar, sort of stranded in Western Washington. And after I turned in a short story for an assignment that was like 4 times the length of all the other students, he then said, well, why don't we have you write a chapter per unit? And if you complete it and you agree to have this submitted for publication, I'll give you an A for the rest of the year. And that was my first book.
Wow, that's a great incentive. Yeah,
it was not bad. It was not bad. And I didn't have to do other homework out of his class. Other homework in other classes, yeah, but I did not have to do busy work. It got me out of busy work, which was enough.
That's really great. That's like a very open-minded teacher, I feel like, and that's
Yes.
a great
Yes.
origin story for your novel writing. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the premise. I'm very curious in particular, what was the inception point for your writing of this novel? Was it like the idea of the island? Was it a particular character or a mood you wanted to evince? Like, where did the project start for you?
It's hard to say because I'd always loved like a locked room or a locked house mystery. Like I grew up reading a lot of Agatha Christie. I grew up reading Dashiell Hammett. I've loved Alfred Hitchcock from before I could read. And so it was, I like when I was a little kid, my favorite movie was Rear Window and stuff, because it was also about like I was very sick as a often very sick as a child, and so the story of a guy who's sort of nursing a broken leg and then another broken leg trapped in his apartment was actually very cathartic, I think. So I've always loved that kind of story, and it's the kind of story that my mother also really loved, so we were always talking about them. And I don't know, I honestly do not recall like the moment where I sort of sat up and was like, oh, you know what would be funny is if, because it seemed like it was so much in the popular culture. Like it's, I had the idea for this before stuff like We Crashed or Silicon Valley or like, or some of these things. And I think it was probably when I sort of was thinking about it to myself, it was probably like Startups plus Lord of the Flies and stuff. And I think for a long time that was kind of more my vision of it. It was actually like a lot grittier or like a lot more like that. And then it turned into something else over time. Like my editor, Miriam Weinberg, would say every time I turned in, she'd say, every time you turn in a draft of this, it's a different genre. and stuff. Like it was a science fiction novel, it was a mystery novel, it was a thriller, it was a romance, it was a spy novel, it was like all these different things. And the only thing that stuck around draft to draft was the sense of humor, which is one of the things that people have sort of gotten in touch about, was like, this is really funny, this is just really funny. And like I was not expecting to laugh, but it's really funny. And so I like to think that that's because it's not a comic novel by any stretch. It's just populated by funny people. It's it's not a comedy novel. It's just that the people in it are witty and stuff. And in fact, Wit was actually the original title of the book. I do remember that. We were going to call it Wit for women in tech, but also for wit, or for that. And I still like that title a great deal. But it's also the title of a play about John Donne and stuff. So I probably should. It was probably good that we avoided it. But in my heart, I still think of it that way.
That is a really great title. And
I loved it.
you're absolutely correct that like the characters are all very funny. And I think like it plays into character in really interesting ways too, because like some are funny because they are defensive, some are funny because like they're mean, like there's a
Yes, yeah. There's many different kinds of funny. And I think it's also because the novel is written from the perspective of a Canadian who is working for Americans in Canada. The novel presupposes that at some point in the novel's past, for some reason, for a reason that is never explained, Americans start sending their students to Canada to like boarding school or to do their undergrad or to do those types of things, or they start sending their kids out of the country. And Canada is one of the easier places and less expensive given the exchange rate. And so she has had to work for a lot of Americans as a Canadian, and the Canadian and American senses of humor butt heads a little bit. And now it's, I think a lot more Americans and a lot of audiences generally are like a lot more familiar with the Canadian sense of humor, thanks to stuff like Schitt's Creek, stuff like Letterkenny. There's the classic SCTV stuff and so on, but like there's now more recent exemplars of what that sense of humor is. And I think Letterkenny and Shoresy and like that entire continuum of Canadian TV really gets at how vicious really gets how really mean the Canadian sense of humor can be, which is itself also a holdover from the British too, right? It's there's parts where it's very much the very dry English sense of humor, and that and the American way of being are occasionally at odds.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up that culture clash because it was a very interesting aspect to me that sometimes does, I think, sort of venture into like cultural imperialism, and like
Mhm.
Americans showing up and expecting people to live the way that they do when they arrive places. And I'm also really glad that you brought up the, sort of the mysterious goings on in America because it's all happening at the fringes. And I'm really kind of curious about that sort of like offstage dystopian world building. I'm curious about like how you chose what to reveal, what to obscure. Like, how do you sort of build something big that's happening, but that you are not depicting, if that makes sense?
I think like it's I wanted it to sort of be background flavor that influences decisions that the characters make without it being the focus of their lives, because I think that's also how Canadians sort of approach America generally, is sort of like, well, the our the guy who could come up and kill you at any time is having a bad day again. Like it's sort of like dealing with that. I think the famous joke is something like living above a meth lab or something like that. Like that's the sort of common parlance or whatever. But it really is about like being aware of all of these things, and knowing that they can have a profound impact on your life, which, for example, during lockdowns they really did. I mean, that was the first time that that border had closed. It's the longest border in the world, the longest contiguous land border in the world, I believe. And it closed for the first time in, I think, like 200 years, and stuff, probably since 1812, really. So it was a big deal to have it shut, and that was because there was something that was affecting both countries. It takes a lot to sort of sunder that relationship, or to permanently alter it. At the same time, there is one party who is constantly aware of the moods and the shifts of the other, which is a dynamic that gets replicated in the story.
Yeah.
Not entirely by design. Now that I think about it, I wish I could say that I planned it that way, but I think it's sort of one of those things that you can't necessarily plan. It wasn't like I was sitting here drafting all the allegory for everybody, but it did stick around, so it's got to be true.
Absolutely, I would say it is. Yeah, I would love if we could talk a little bit too about Sumter and
Mm,
WUV, the startup.
yes.
I've been waiting to say that this whole interview, like
I
WUV.
had to explain that to somebody, like someone who lives in New Zealand. My former agent, who has since retired, it was, not a thing that is said in New Zealand or English. And I had to, she's like, is it woo? Is it like, she wasn't sure like how to say it. And I was like, no, 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 no. Have you ever heard a child say wub if they have a speech impediment, like when they're just learning how to talk and stuff? And because in the accent, it would sound different.
Mm.
Right. And so it's always really fun when people do kind of sound it out and they're like, oh no.
Yeah, it's sort of like it's a fascinating idea and it's horrifying. And and
Yes.
I really love, like I sort of love the depiction of Sumter and his relationship to this idea. And I think it does speak to the parallels that you were just talking about because yeah, he is very much like a big kid with like this toy that he wants to play with without regard of like what it's gonna do, right? So can you explain the idea a little bit and sort of where
So
uh
the company that our protagonist Kristen works for is founded and sort of co-founded by a man named Sumter Williams. And Sumter he's worked on many technologies in the past. He's an orphan. He inherited a vast amount of wealth from his family and when they died, and he has put that capital into different ventures throughout his life. He dropped out of university. He, did all these different things, but he was educated for secondary school at a boys boarding school in Canada, in Toronto. And that's where he met some of the people who later became the principals of this startup. now this startup WUV is sort of working on a technology that is quite literally emotional currency. It turns emotional reactions into a score by measuring like things like galvanic response and like heart rate changes and pupil dilation, like the whole, I don't know, Voight-Kampf score into a score that can be translated into money and into crypto. So he wants to turn like hidden emotions into a hidden currency, essentially. And he is very eager to do that. He's very excited to do that. And he actually sort of spends part of an early part of the book explaining sort of how how it works or how it should work, and then why he's into that. And he justifies it by saying that he wants a global currency that will mean more in the context of space exploration. He thinks that having different currencies across in an interstellar economy makes no sense. And that this is like the truest expression of something, and therefore it's better than like a commodities market.
Yeah, it is sort of the pinnacle of like a guy falling in love with his own idea, and
Yes.
and
Yes.
also, sort of
Very
with the
much so.
added thing of like just being surrounded by people who don't want to naysay you or critique you. With the
Yeah,
exception of
no.
Kristen, she'll give him sass every once in a while, but
Yeah. But I mean, you can understand it because he's kind of a fun guy to be around. Like he can be very supportive. He is kind of that Gatsby friend, right? Where he takes everybody on the ride. Like, the party is amazing. Everybody wants to go until they can't leave.
yeah. Yeah, it is a great sort of like what's the cliche, like the frog in the boiling water. You don't really know.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I knew a lot of people who had toxic bosses or like had kind of weird relationships to their employers, because I'm a freelancer, so like I don't have a straight job. Like I'm not committed to, I'm very like, I don't know, work-wise promiscuous, I guess. And so I see the way that people are with their bosses, and that's always fascinating to me because it's a relationship I don't have.
Mm.
So it's always interesting to me because it's so foreign. And so in a weird way, like I spent a lot of time with this book, like feeling kind of a lot of, I guess, imposter syndrome, being like, how can you write about this environment? Like you've never had a job like this. Like you have visited environments like this, but you have not been in one like day in, day out. And so what do you really know? And what I know is what people don't tell their bosses in the workshops I run.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when you run foresight workshops, when you facilitate workshops about the future in various companies, you surface the concerns that are not mentioned elsewhere, or you surface the concerns that otherwise you might be punished for mentioning, right? My job is to create a context where it is safe and appreciated and valued to surface the concerns, the hopes, the dreams, the fears, anxieties, like the visions that people might have been sitting on for a very long time about their company, about where the world is going, about their technology, things like that. And so I hear all the stuff that their own company won't necessarily hear until later. And that, I think, was the preparation, was like knowing what was seething underneath was big preparation for this. And from that perspective, I was like, well, it doesn't matter if you've done this or not. You know what these people have to say. And you've seen these things from a cold neutral third party perspective of like, you get parachuted in, you drop in, you say hello, you do the thing, and you come away knowing a lot more about these people and their relationships to each other than even they know.
Mm. Yeah. I imagine you get to observe sort of like the gap between how they speak to their bosses and then how they speak about their bosses when they're not present. That's got to be fascinating.
There's some of that, but it's also just watching the interpersonal dynamics between people and sort of saying like, it's not that your company has a problem with this technology, it's that your company has a problem with that bully who is forestalling everything. Like the reason you haven't moved forward on this project is because you all are excluding this one guy at lunch. You know, you actually get all of your you actually get all of your best ideas on your Friday afternoons, but you're cutting certain people out. Like very basic things that are like, you know, it's not, you know, sometimes it is an extremely complicated thing, and other times it is quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. Yeah, that is super interesting and lots of
Yeah.
good fodder. Yeah, for a book like
Yeah.
So I have one more question before we go, and that is about Kristen, because she's such a
Sure.
fascinating protagonist. And so I spent a lot of time reading this and thinking about unreliable narrators. Like she's not a first person narrator in the traditional way.
No.
Um, but it got me thinking that some narrators are reliable because they are lying to you, and some are unreliable because they are lying to themselves or obscuring things from themselves or not letting themselves
Yes.
acknowledge
Yes.
things.
Yes.
Where do you think Kristen's coming from in that regard? And how did you shape her perspective as sort of like the, you know, the perspective person on these events?
I think like Kristen has a very sharp view on other people. Um, she has a narrative of how things unfold. She has a narrative of reality, I would say, that she is very committed to and that she mostly fully believes. I think one of the touching things that happened as I was writing the book multiple times was that every time I rewrote it, Kristen actually gained more appreciation for her coworkers. Like she starts out not necessarily liking them terribly much. And then by the end, she's like, oh wow, I've actually spent more time with these people in this environment, and I know more about them, and I actually do appreciate them more. um I caught myself like really enjoying that aspect of her. But I think she's unreliable in that she has a narrative and she sticks to it. She's also sort of paid to be an unreliable narrator by her boss, as the sort of as what she is called, which is the chief emotional manager, which is really a chief of staff position. So her whole job involves gaslighting to some degree. And so she is paid to be this thing, this unreliable narrator. In terms of like other like prototypical examples that I was thinking of, I thought a lot about sort of the Catcher in the Rye of like, you know, there is an incident that we never discuss, or there's a thing that we never talk about. It informs all the action in the story, but we never discuss it, or we never mention it until we have to. That is very much her. And that's also kind of comes from like the Canadian Gothic tradition of like, you know, the novels in that tradition do that as well. And short stories in that tradition do that as well. That the idea of there being a Gothic secret that is always waiting to surface and waiting to sort of rupture reality. You know, I've had previous novels taught in Gothic literature courses before. My first novel, Bien, which is about robots who eat each other, no, really, was taught at Swansea in a Gothic lit course. And so like I guess it's a thing that has always fascinated me. And so there was some of that. I thought about Catcher in the Rye. I thought obviously like a lot about sort of you know, Chuck Palahniuk and stuff like that. I read a lot of those in my 20s, and I am unashamed to admit that. And of course stuff like Gone Girl and stuff like those books, and the Ripley novels like Patricia Highsmith. I actually did read Highsmith's, what is it called? Plotting and Writing Suspense Fiction.
Oh,
I
yes.
managed to find a used copy. Like it's tough to find now. And it's right by my Stephen King and my Mur Lafferty and Julia Cameron and Haruki Murakami and Patty Chayefsky and Jeff Vandermeer. There's like one little shelf that's just about that, and all my Le Guin books. But the you know, she makes a really good point about every time you feel yourself slowing down, that's a problem. Like if you are slowing down, so is the reader. And you will know, like she's actually like her entire plotting and writing suspense fiction, the book itself is very thin because the primary instruction of it is operate on your instinct. You know what you're doing.
Nice.
And stuff, and trust yourself. And Highsmith herself was kind of an unreliable narrator, so she knew whereof she spoke, right? And it's so I read a lot of her work, and I read this, and it clarified things enormously.
Wow.
Actually.
There's a lot of good tips in there, I think, for our writing listeners, good text that is like a greatest hits of like the writers writing about writing. That was really,
Yes. Yeah, no. I have them all. Much good they've done me. I probably should read them more.
Well, I mean, I think they've served you well because I loved this book and I'm very excited for our patrons to read it. So thank you so much for coming and talking about it with me.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Okay, listeners, it's your turn now. Please check out Glass Houses. It's out. By the time that you hear this, it'll be out in the world. So please check it out. Go to your favorite independent bookstore, library, wherever you like to go for your books. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.